There it is. It's okay. Yes, sir. 10 minutes. All right. That's what I get for going to the bathroom first. I like a moderator. I like a moderator that stays on time. He's doing his job. All right. So 10 minutes. Well, I'll go very, very quickly through this. So my second talk is about aminoglycoside toxicity and some of the things, sort of public health and pharmacology involved here. I will skip over, given my time, I'll skip over the slides which basically convince you that hearing loss is a major problem in the world, and we're seeing rising rates of hearing loss, and we're doing a fairly ineffective job of treating those patients with hearing aids. Hearing loss is one of the top 10 diseases recognized as the global burden of disease, and what in the developing countries, as in most places, the predominant hearing loss is sensory neural hearing loss, not conductive hearing loss. So we talk a lot about infections, but most of the hearing loss is sensory neural. There are a lot of sort of common factors, but one of the most preventive things that we can do to prevent hearing loss, sensory neural hearing loss, is ototoxicity. And when you look at ototoxicity, the major offender here is aminoglycosides. And the major offender for two reasons. First of all, they're one of the most ototoxic drugs that we have, that we use compared with other things. And the other thing is that the population, the exposed population, is extremely high. So I think most of us recognize that aminoglycosides are ototoxic. There are definitely appropriate ways that we could use these drugs for genital urinary infections. For neonatal sepsis, it's probably the highest risk population for aminoglycoside toxicity, and also tuberculosis. So aminoglycosides are routinely used for multi-drug resistant tuberculosis, and this has some definite geographical implications in that there are places in the world where tuberculosis is extremely high. When you look at industrial countries, though, the rate of gentamicin ototoxicity is actually very low, around 1%, and this is mainly because we hardly ever use this drug anymore. But there are still some high-risk populations. The PICU babies that are treated for neonatal sepsis are at higher risk within developing countries, within the developed countries. But in developing countries, there's an extremely high rate of exposure of gentamicin, and this is a major concern. So the WHO has identified this as a major concern. They're widely used, and very high rates of, up to 10% of all antibiotics used in some areas of the country. There are also particular populations that are at risk. There are genetic predispositions in some populations, and other populations that just because of the sheer exposure of the drug. What I'm going to share with you is a little bit of data from our study in Nicaragua, where we looked at 100 deaf children, and what we found is that nearly a third of those had been exposed to gentamicin, and we sort of traced back, and we took the history and found that the gentamicin exposure often correlated with the timing of the hearing loss. One of the problems with this data is that many of these children have multiple causes for their hearing loss. And so they may have been given gentamicin, but they may also have a family history or have a history of meningitis. So it's often hard to tease out what role the gentamicin was playing. So the problem is that in many developing countries, gentamicin is completely unregulated. Oftentimes, these drugs are available directly through pharmacies. There have been studies in Bangladesh and Venezuela similar. That over 90% of the aminoglycosides do not come from physicians, but from pharmacists. And often the use is inappropriate. So they're often used for upper respiratory infections or other infections that can be very easily treated with other medications. So these are some of the factors that increase our risk of gentamicin toxicity in the developing world. And I think what I want to try to convince you is that I think increased exposure is the biggest factor. All right, so just a few words about pathophysiology. So there are actually multiple sort of layers of pathophysiology that are relevant for gentamicin. The first is that it's sort of hyper-concentrated within the inner ear. And so the drug is actually transported into the cochlea and gets into the hair cells in very high concentrations. The first sort of site of injury is the glutamate receptors, and so this gets back to the excitotoxicity that I just spoke to you about. This figure that I used in the previous talk is actually a figure from an animal study looking at that MK801 drug to block aminoglycoside toxicity in an animal model. But the second factor is free radical formation. And so again, just like what we talked about before, we have oxidative stress going on within the cell, and that is a major factor in terms of the cascade of cell death from glycosides. And so one of the things that we can do there is to block that inflammatory cascade. And one of the things that we can use to block that inflammatory cascade is arachidonic acid. And so the other sort of very effective free radical scavenger or blocker is aspirin. And so I'm going to share with you some data looking at aspirin to control gentamicin toxicity. So this is a study by Shaw and Schock where they looked at guinea pigs exposed to aminoglycosides and gave the guinea pigs aspirin, and what they found was that when they gave the gentamicin, the top one is normal, the second one is the gentamicin without the aspirin, and the third one is hair cells with the aspirin. And so you can see that they've got hair cell preservation. They went on, Johann Schock went on to actually do a clinical study in China where they have very high rates of gentamicin toxicity, and they gave patients the high doses of aspirin at the same time that they were given the gentamicin. They saw no decrease in the effectiveness of the antibiotic, but there was a significant benefit in terms of hearing loss preservation. Unfortunately, this has not really ever been widely adopted, and I think part of the reason why this has not been widely adopted, as I alluded to earlier, is that it's really the pediatric population is at highest risk. And so these were adults, and so what's the appropriate dose? This was 3 grams of aspirin per day, so it's a very high dose of aspirin. And so I think they're sort of translating this to the pediatric population is a bit difficult. The other thing that's important when thinking about the pathophysiology is that one of the organs that's primarily affected is the mitochondria, through blocking of protein synthesis. And as many of you probably know, there's actually a genetic predisposition. So there's a mitochondrial gene that can predispose you to gentamicin toxicity. This is the mitochondrial DNA is circular, and you actually have multiple mitochondria within each cell. And so unlike the nucleic DNA, where you only have one copy of DNA, with mitochondria you have multiple copies within the cell. So you can have variable degrees of expression within a single cell. So what happens with this mutation is that it actually, this mitochondrial DNA is actually very similar to the DNA for ribosomal RNA in bacteria. And so what happens is that when you have this mutation, it actually makes the human ribosomal RNA look very similar to the bacterial. And so it's much more susceptible to gentamicin. There are several genes here that cause several mutations that can cause this. The most common is that the A1-1555 gene. This is actually very common in Hispanic patients, and so in Spain they have families with very high rates of this problem. And also the other place where this is very common in the world is in China. All right, so there are actually sort of very interesting phenotypic expressions of this. So it turns out that turns out that, we've got 3 more minutes. He's stalking me here. I'm going to be okay on time. I promise. So the interesting thing, this is actually looking at over the course of age for people that has this genetic predisposition. What you see is that these patients actually develop hearing loss even without aminoglycosides. But if they're given aminoglycosides, they have an immediate, sort of one single dose of aminoglycosides can make them profoundly deaf because they have this predisposing genetic cause. So where we got involved with this was looking at this population of 100 children that I mentioned earlier in Nicaragua. This is in Jinotega, Nicaragua, a very remote part of the country with a lot of consanguinity, a lot of marriages in the families. And as I said, we saw multiple causes, and we saw, in addition to gentamicin, we saw a lot of these patients had very strong family histories of hearing loss. And so we asked ourselves, well, is it possible that we have a high, and also, these are mostly indigenous, non-Spanish lineage, but we asked ourselves, could it be possible that we have a aminoglycoside mitochondrial DNA mutation in the population? As it turns out, that we looked in 30 of our kids that had the gentamicin, and we found no mutations of the mitochondrial DNA. When we looked a little closer at this, though, we found out that many of them had sort of unregulated or inappropriate use of the antibiotics, and they were actually geographically clustered. And so what we found was that one particular town that had a little bit higher level of medical care had a high rates of gentamicin exposed to toxicity. And it got me to propose this sort of model. And so what I think we have, like many things when we're looking at causes of hearing loss in the developing world, what we have is in the very highly developed countries, we see really good regulation of these sorts of things. So that the drugs are rarely used, they're used only appropriately, they're monitored very closely, they're given by physicians. On the far end of the spectrum, in the very poorly developed areas, you basically don't have exposure to these kinds of drugs because you don't have adequate medical care. And the people that are at the highest risk are the ones that are in the middle. They're sort of falling through the donut hole, if you will. So these are patients that have access to the medications, but they're used inappropriately. And so prevention, I think, really we need to focus on sort of establishing and enforcing regulations, trying to inform both physicians and the public, and really try to provide other alternatives, and perhaps using, promoting the use of aspirin, co-administration of aspirin. So this was a public health campaign that we developed in Nicaragua after our study. We have a little poster there to the left, which is really more geared towards patient information, and on the right is a pamphlet that we developed for physicians. So I think you really need sort of a two-pronged approach to public health awareness. So in conclusion, the aminoglycoside ototoxicity includes free radical formation and genetic susceptibility. Aspirin can be very effective, but unfortunately is not widely used. And the prevalence of that mutation varies a great deal, and I think you're really sort of focusing on those public awareness and the public health campaigns is how we can prevent this cause of hearing loss. So that's, okay, so I'm like 1 minute over. I appreciate your time. That was not bad for 10 minutes. Do we have time for any questions?